Hello and welcome to free Excel tutorial videos. In today's video, I will show you how you can create an interactive Excel pivot chart. There are several ways that we can add a pivot table chart to a pivot table. Most importantly is you must first have the pivot table in your Excel. So with a pivot table and a pivot chart, if you make a change to the pivot table, the change will also occur in the pivot table chart. Okay, so you can actually have the pivot chart created um, and show the changes as you make the changes to either the pivot table or the pivot table chart. So if you have a data set like this, and in case that you haven't created your pivot table, you can actually create the pivot table and the pivot table chart together. So at the insert tab, you can come to the pivot table option. So you can have an option here and you can create the pivot table chart directly. So if you already have a pivot table chart, okay, you can if you already have a pivot table, you can add in a pivot table chart. Okay, to add a pivot chart, select any cell in the pivot table and come to the pivot table option up here in the option tab, and choose create pivot table. Okay, this one, create pivot chart. So um, you can also create a chart, with Excel 2007. You can come to insert and create a chart from this chart group over here from the insert tab. Okay, but for this video, let's just use the option of creating the pivot table chart from the pivot table itself. So come over here and have one cell selected in the pivot table. Come over to the pivot table tools and click on pivot chart. Okay, so once I click this, you will begin by choosing the type of chart. So I'm just going to choose the column chart, and there you go. You will see the pivot chart created in the same worksheet as your pivot table. Okay, this is the default setting in Excel. Okay, and as well as at the same time, you will also get this pivot chart filter pane. Okay, let me just close this first, and we'll talk about this later on. Okay, so now we have this. We have our, let's move this chart over here and come down a little bit. So now we have our pivot table. We also have our pivot chart, and also the pivot table fill list. Okay, so any changes that I make in the pivot table will be reflected in the chart itself, and vice versa. Okay, if I make any changes in the chart, which I can do from the chart filter, the changes will also be done here in the pivot table. Okay, it will be reflected in the pivot table. So let's take a look at the pivot table. Okay, so in the pivot table, I have here sales, I have the label for unit shipped, and also the average unit price. Okay, so what I want to do now is, let's say I have the pivot table pivot chart here. I'm going to move it a little bit higher, a little bit, so that you can see. So let's come to the pivot table fill list, and I'm going to remove the average price per unit, okay, from the values. So I'm going to remove this, and as you can see, as I remove that from the pivot table, the price per unit is also removed from the pivot chart. Okay, so with the pivot chart, what we can do is we can adjust the size, we can move it around, we can adjust the size, And you also have various options to play with here. Okay, if you come up here to if you when you have the chart selected, notice that we have this pivot chart tools. Okay, if I select outside, I would not have that option. Okay, so if I click on the chart, you will see that I have this pivot chart tools tab, and from here we have the design, we have the layout, the format, and also the analyze tab and analyze option. So we can also move the pivot chart to another location. Say, I don't like how it looks here in this worksheet because it's very congested and I cannot see the data in a good way. So what you can do is you can select the pivot chart, come to the design tab, and over here you have move chart. Okay, so let's do this. Let's move the chart, move it to a new worksheet and click OK. Okay, so now we have the pivot chart in a new worksheet, and along with it we have the pivot table fill list menu. Okay, so I'm going to close this. Okay, I'm going to show you how you can bring that up. Okay, so if you want to bring up the pivot chart filter panel as well as the pivot chart fill table, you can come over here to the analyze. You can come over here and select pivot chart, and you will have the pivot chart filter pane. If you want to look at the fill list for the pivot table, you click on this fill list and you will see the pivot table fill list over here. Okay, so let's move this to over here. Okay, so we have these two options. I can close this, and if I click this, it will come back. It's like a toggle on and toggle off. Okay, so now you can filter and make changes to your pivot chart directly, and remember, the pivot chart and the pivot table is connected to one another, so any changes made to either one of it will create the same changes for the other. So okay, let's bring back the pivot chart filter and remove this. Alright, let's see what we can do from here. Okay, so notice that we have this filter pane, and we can make changes to the pivot chart directly from here. And this is where we can see how this pivot chart can become an interactive chart. Okay, let's say that I'm in a meeting and I'm speaking to my clients or my employees or my co-workers about this pivot chart, and we have 5 products over here. Okay, 1 2 3 4 5, and say that we only want to focus on 2 products, 2 specific products. So I can come over here to the pivot chart filter pane, and I can come over here to the product. Notice that we have a drop down, and I can select let's say I can deselect and select 2 products. Okay, and I'm going to select the accessories and the business software. Okay, and now you can see the figures only for these 2 products. I can do this in the middle of the meeting, and in case in the middle of the meeting I have to make a change to the pivot chart again, because let's say now we want to discuss about the other products, so I can easily come to the product again. I can select all, or I can remove the other 2 and click OK. Okay, see how the pivot chart changes when I make the changes in the filter pane. Okay, there you go. Also, I can also use the filter in the date section, to see specific figures in any given month in our data set. For this example, we have our dates like this. So say that I only want to see the sales for these 3 products for only the month April. So I can deselect and I select April. Okay, so I click OK. Alright, so we only have sales for these 2 products in April. Okay, so it is really easy to make the chart interactive, and in addition, of course, you can play with the design of the pivot chart. Okay, let's come over here to the design tab. Okay, let's remove this filter pane, and there are many designs that you can choose from. Let me just open up the list. You see, you can choose from any sort of design that you want, that you think can suit your data the best. Okay, and then there is the layout. You can choose from chart title. You can choose to display it at the center overlay, above the chart, and there are more title options that you can play with. There is also the axis title, where you can put titles over here and over here, and there is the legend. You can show it at the right, show the legend at the top, and the data labels. See, let's put these data labels. Okay, you can see the figure of this exact figure of this chart here are displayed in the bar. Okay, and then there is axis, grid lines, plot area, and so on. Okay, and then there is the format, where you can change the text and etc. Okay, so as you can see, there are several options that you can play around with to make your pivot chart an interactive chart, as you do your presenting or as you use it in a meeting. So it is really simple to use, and you can customize the chart to your liking. Okay, so that is how. Okay, before I go, if I go back to the pivot table, you will see now that I only have computer and network. Okay, that means when I make the changes to the pivot chart, now we only have computer and network, and when I come back to the pivot table, we have the exact same information. Okay, the grand total, the computer is 1492 for the sales, and if you verify it, it's 1492 for the sales, 232 for the unit shipped. Okay, and if I come back to the pivot table, 232 for the unit shipped. Okay, so that is how you can create an interactive Excel pivot chart in Microsoft Excel. And that's it for this video. I will see you in the next tutorial video.